Welcome to ITDP Twitter Space. I'm Aswathy Dilip, Managing Director, ITDP India, and I hope that each one of you are having a fabulous day today. Today, we're here to talk about creating resilient, accessible cities for all. And thank you, each of our listeners, for joining us. Joining us for this interesting discussion are our speakers from across the world. We have with us Aimee Gauthier, ITDP Chief Knowledge Officer, Sonal Shah, Executive Director, Center for Sustainable and Equitable Cities, founder the Urban Catalyst, Quemuel Arroyo, Chief Accessibility Officer, State of New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority, Iain McKinnon, Director of Inclusive Design from Global Disability Innovation Hub, and Arya Rudhita from the Ministry of Transport, Indonesia. I'd also like to thank Alphonse Tam, ITDP Communications team, for providing technical support for this session. So let's start with asking, why are we discussing about creating resilient and accessible cities for all? Just sharing some data points, more than 1 billion people globally experience some form of disability. And more than half of all people with disabilities live in urban areas. To give us some more context for this discussion, I'd like to invite you, Aimee. Could you share some thoughts and frame our discussion for today? Over to you, Aimee.
Great. Thanks so much, Aswathy. And it's really fun to be here in ITDP's Public Square. I think that's really awesome. And I'm really happy to be here to talk about this. Just to give a little bit of background, in June this year at the World Urban Forum, ITDP and World Enable released a joint report called Access and Persons with Disabilities in Urban Areas. That was co-written by Sonal Shah, whom we have here today. Also co-written with Luis Artieda and Victor Pineda from World Enabled, and Mackenzie Allen and Ramon Cruz from ITDP. And so this report looks at the intersection of transport and land use and access for people with disabilities, and how when transport and land use work together, they can enable access, and how when they don't, they actually lead to exclusion. And so just to make the fine point here, accessibility is a precondition for inclusion, and transport and land use are the critical foundations for enabling that access. But we see that transportation barriers and exclusion are predominant obstacles for people with disabilities to achieve personal autonomy, to reach educational and employment opportunities, to achieve social participation. And all of this is compounded in moments of crisis. So as you were saying, people with disabilities are 15% of our global population. 80% of those live in lower to middle income countries, and 3/4 of those are estimated to be women. Many people with disabilities live below the poverty line. And so it's because of either discrimination or a lack of access to education and employment opportunities, or the higher costs of care. But in addition, most people will experience some form of disability in their lifetime, whether it be temporary or permanent. And just to, sorry, I'm sick. Just to say that disability is diverse. Sorry. So disability is the interaction of a person's health and functioning with an unaccommodating social and physical environment. So just to briefly touch on what we can do from a transport and land use perspective, we need to be thinking about reducing the trip length through mixed-use neighborhoods. Sorry, creating calm environments and safe environments, creating universally accessible public spaces. This includes public transport. This includes wide, unobstructed, connected walkways and safe crossings, connected, protected bike lane networks, frequent, reliable public transport. And just a note here about communications and wayfinding as being really key to allowing access for a variety of different users. So I'm just going to pause here with one final note that people with disabilities also face a heightened risk due to climate change. They're 2 to 4 times more likely to die or be critically injured in a climate related disaster like a cyclone or a hurricane. It's partly because of pre-existing inequities. It's also partly because they're not included or thought about really in disaster preparedness plans or climate plans. So as we think about making access, increasing access and making our cities more inclusive, we also need to be thinking about doing so with resiliency, and social resiliency will play a big part in that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Aimee. And I think one of the important points that you had mentioned is that persons with disability are not just somewhere out there. You mentioned that everyone experiences some form of disability during the time that we live on this planet Earth. And just today, I was thinking about my grandmother. She was a very independent woman who traveled up to the Himalayas in India when she was much younger. Today, when she is 86 years old, she's confined to the four walls of our house, though she can move around, just because the cities are not designed for persons with disabilities. So you and I and all of us who are listening, we might all be this person that we are talking about. So before we jump into the conversation, let's hear about, let's just go around and listen from our speakers about the work that they're doing and maybe a point that they'd like to highlight about the work that they're doing right now. Can I maybe turn to Sonal? Sonal, would you like to share with us about something that you've done that would be really interesting for our team, for our listeners? Over to you, Sonal.
Thanks, Aswathy. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation and dialogue. Through our work, where we advise governments and development banks on creating gender inclusive and universally accessible infrastructure, I think one of the key pieces that we've observed is putting decision makers in the shoes, if you will, of the users. That can go a long way in sensitizing them to what a person with an insensitive environment and how can they be limited by these barriers. So I think this would be really interesting from my perspective.
Thank you so much, Sonal. Going next to Quemuel Arroyo, what are your thoughts? And we look forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me in this conversation. It's truly a pleasure to be part of the discussion. I am Quemuel Arroyo, and I am the Chief Accessibility Officer here at the MTA, where prior to the pandemic, we were moving 15 million people a day through all of our various different assets. The MTA here in the state of New York operates the Long Island Railroad, Metro North, and all of New York City Transit, and any bridge or tunnel in and around the city that you pay for. So lots of foot traffic. Today, we're seeing around 5 million people a day. So the numbers are coming back steadily. But in my role as head of accessibility, I'm really concentrated in how we communicate to our customers, our motorists, our folks in the railroads, our buses and subways, particularly to the 1 million plus New Yorkers with disabilities that we know live in the tri-state area, 1 million plus in the state of New York, who are also utilizing our public transportation system to get around. We already heard earlier about how many people with disabilities are impacted and devastated in natural disasters. And the main crux for that, in my opinion, is a lack of access to information. I've always been a fond believer that access to information is access to independence and successful outcomes. So I'm really focused on reaching our customers, particularly those with disabilities, so that they have no ambiguity, so that there's no question of what's to occur next, particularly during a emergency situation. I'm focusing on delivering effective communication, ensuring that any audio announcement is provided also to someone who's a non-auditory, ensuring that my train conductors and all of my staff are able to successfully and effectively communicate with someone who doesn't speak per se, and ensuring that we have signage, that we leverage our digital screens to deliver sign for the first time in any transit system in America. And of course, ensuring that anything that we retrofit, that we outfit with hearing loops and Bluetooth that we would be able to connect to an individual's hearing devices so that they can also have access to information. Again, I believe that leveraging communication tools that you build now will help in emergency situations and really decrease the ambiguity, the sense of not knowing what to do, what happens next when you are in an emergency. And we learned through the pandemic and COVID that, you know, we are not leaving people behind when we leverage technologies and internet and mobile solutions. We saw hundreds of thousands of elderly riders, persons with disabilities, all engaging in conversations that they were never a part of, all because those physical barriers were broken when people were able to participate in a digital format. So we know that technology works, and we're leaning into that and leveraging it to engage and communicate with our customers.
Thank you so much, Quemuel. Highlighting not leaving anyone behind while delivering our communication, and that's very strong. Let me now invite Iain McKinnon. Over to you, Iain.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I hope you can hear me okay. My name's Iain McKinnon. I am a co-founder and director of inclusive design at an organisation called the Global Disability Innovation Hub. So we are a research and practice centre driving disability innovation for a fairer world. We are operational currently in about 41 countries, so we work internationally, working with in excess of 70 partners, so we're incredibly open and collaborative in our approach, and we've reached approximately 28 million people since we launched officially back in 2016. So the work we do is, the golden thread really is disability and innovation. We work across 5 key themes, which are assistive and accessible technology, so AT, which is obviously very important for many disabled people. Inclusive design, which is primarily my area, looking at the inclusive design of the built environment. And we also look at culture and participation, climate and crisis resilience, which is obviously pertinent to today's conversations, and also inclusive educational technology. So I'll lead the inclusive design theme for GDI Hub. And I'll just mention quickly a recent current work that we're doing that's very relevant is we are leading a large multi-year, multi-partner programme funded by UK Aid, so UK government, which is called AT 2030, so assistive technology to the year 2030. And it's essentially, the title is to test what works, to enable access to life-changing assistive technology for all. It's got lots of partners involved. There's lots of sub-programs. You know, it's a very rich and diverse program of work, very interesting research happening. But I'll focus on my sub-program, which is looking at inclusive innovation, because obviously to get AT is one thing, but if the environment in which you live prohibits its use, then it's redundant. So what we've been doing currently is to do a deep dive of research on the inclusive design of 6 cities, predominantly in developing countries around the world, to really build a kind of global picture of where inclusive design is at in these cities, so that we can then compare and contrast and ultimately write what we're calling a global action report to make a step change to help support more disability inclusive and also climate resilient cities, because climate resilience is coming through strongly in the research. So those cities quickly are Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, Varanasi in India, Surakarta in Indonesia, Nairobi in Kenya, Freetown in Sierra Leone, and Medellin in Colombia. And we're halfway, kind of just over halfway through that research. And yeah, it's unique, and a lot of the findings coming from that are really helping us as we position ourselves to kind of move forward. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Iain. And when we do get into our conversation, I'll come back to you for more details on this front. So now just going to our last speaker, Arya Yoga Rudhita, could you please share some of your work? Over with you.
Hi, Aswathy. Thank you. My name is Yoga. So I'm from Jakarta, Indonesia. I'm 42 years old. I'm paraplegic. I use wheelchair for my mobility. I work at the Ministry of Transportation in Indonesia, and there are 9 employees with disabilities currently working at the MOT. And almost everyone is using public transportation in commuting to work. So it's nice to hear other experience, and also to share my experience in the progress of inclusive transportation in Indonesia. Thank you. I think that's all.
It's wonderful, Arya, to hear that Jakarta and Indonesia is creating creating infrastructure where, irrespective of your ability, you're able to travel, and that's great to know. And we'd like to hear more about exactly what the city is doing. So let's now jump into the conversation at hand, and starting with the very first question. We had multiple of our speakers talking about the importance of designing cities and urban spaces that are built around universal design and accessibility principles. So could we delve a little more for our listeners about how are these cities designed? Iain, can I point to you, because you did speak about your work with 6 cities across the world. So if you could highlight some points that these cities are embracing. Over to you, Iain.
Yeah, sure. It's been fascinating doing this research because different cities in different countries around the world are all at different stages in the journey, really, in the process of kind of, realizing, how important and how beneficial good inclusive design is, the wider benefits that it brings. And so I think what we're seeing in the research is that across the board, really, there's an understanding and an appreciation now that this is important, this is the right thing to do. And and then you start to see cities at different stages of kind of implementation of, okay, what's our response to this now? What are we going to do about it? And as you would imagine, some cities are further ahead than others, and that's okay. I think what's been, I suppose, reassuring from our point of view is that it's on the agenda, certainly in the places that we've been working. So that's been interesting. I think the other thing that's been really fascinating for me personally, I am based in the UK, the United Kingdom, in Scotland actually, and although our GDI hub's based in University College London, so in London, in the UK. So for me, getting to grips and understanding the kind of rich kind of cultural differences, international kind of ways of working, different approaches, different languages, heritage and things, that's been really fascinating from my point of view to see the different approaches to disability, different approaches to design, different approaches to kind of urban planning. And so you have to be very respectful of that. And so it's very much a two-way process, I think, from our experience and from our work, is really it's mutual shared learning, between ourselves as the researchers in this case and the cities that we're working with. So the way that we work is across the 3 Ps. It's people, policy and practice. And that's kind of the basis of the research we've been doing in these 6 cities. So we talk to people. So we usually employ a local organisation of persons with disabilities, a local OPD in the city, alongside typically a local NGO to support us with all our data collection. We started this research in March 2020, so right on the cusp of COVID. So we've had to do everything till now really remotely, which has been, challenging at times, but actually the silver lining has been we've relied more heavily on local partners, which has actually been a good thing in terms of building capacity, we think. So speaking to local disabled people to really understand what's it like as a disabled person living in this city. We then speak to the policy makers, so city government representatives, officials from across different ministries, to really get a grasp of what's the current kind of political policy point of view with regards to disability, but also accessibility, inclusive design. And then practitioners, so we talk to architects, urban designers, planners, transport planners, designers, to really understand what's the reality of delivering projects in this city. And from all of that information, we kind of synthesize that to essentially get a snapshot of where inclusive design's at. And what's important, I think, for us anyway, is to understand where are the challenges and the barriers that exist, but also what's been done really well and where are the opportunities. And so I guess to try and give some examples of that, you've got initiatives where public transport, there is some good examples of public transport, looking across kind of, some of the examples we often reference, not necessarily from our own case study cities, but looking at India, for example, You've got kind of metro systems that have been designed and built, Delhi Metro and things, to really, with a real emphasis on making sure that they're accessible for disabled people. But there's always lessons to be learned, I think, and so it's important across inclusive design. You're always learning, and it's always kind of evolving. So it's important, I think, that you learn those lessons and take them with you and share them, and so that future projects can also benefit from that. That's really important.
Thank you so much, Iain. Keep learning, understand the local issues from the stakeholders themselves were key points that you'd mentioned. And I'd like to turn to Arya. Arya, as a user yourself, you'd mentioned about how it's quite accessible in Indonesia. Could you share a few aspects that actually make it accessible?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's not really accessible like in the developed countries, but we are getting there. So in the city, most of the bus here are run by a company named Transjakarta. So most of the bus are accessible, but some of the bus stops are not accessible yet. So it is still ongoing. They are going through revitalization. And also the train service is accessible for the most part. Some of the train stations were made in the 70s, so it's not really accessible, but most part now accessible. And the helper that were assigned to help people with disabilities are mostly well equipped with training and SOP. So it has gone through a lot of progress, I think. Before 2012, there were less access places or access transportation, but now I think close to 50% or 70% public transportation are accessible.
Thank you so much, Arya. That's definitely very inspiring. And before we move ahead to the next question, I'd also like to just mention that captioning is available under the settings menu as an accessibility issue. So please, as an accessibility option, so please feel free to use the same. Now, I'd also like to let our speakers know that if anyone would like to add a point or so, please raise your hand and we'd be happy to highlight your point as well. So as we move to the next question, as we look at climate resilience specifically, could one of you highlight how can policies and plans that promote accessibility also help protect communities from natural disasters? If there are some examples that you could highlight, that would be excellent. Sonal, would you like to take this question?
Sure. Thanks, Aswathy. And as an organization that is based in the global South, I think some of these issues kind of face us front and center. So I often consult with development banks, and what happens is that becomes an opportunity to build universal accessibility in projects that they finance. So I'm going to give an example of a project that I am leading in Bangladesh, which looks at building climate resilient infrastructure. And our focus as part of a technical assistance program was creating gender inclusive, universally accessible, climate resilient public open spaces. So these are like very, very a very bold mandate, and I think a very ambitious one as well. So as we all know, that Bangladesh is one of the fastest emerging economies with the world's largest active delta, right? And its geographic and climatic advantage is also its biggest threat, as more than half of the population resides in climatically sensitive areas. So we our goal was to partner with the local government engineering department at the central government to create guidelines on how to do, like I mentioned, incorporate nature-based solutions and design gender-inclusive, universally accessible public open spaces, and then pilot test them in two, what we would call Purushavas of Bangladesh. So Purushavas are very small tier 3 towns. Their population may vary anywhere between 9,000 to about 50,000. So they are not your large mega cities where we see a lot of this discussion and debate happening. So one of the key pieces was that the guideline emphasizes an inclusive process. And one of the big pieces that we did as part of the initial initial studies was get in touch with organizations representing women and girls, as well as persons with disabilities. And through that, we found so many nuances, and one of which I will share here, which we hope to address both in the guideline and in the pilot demonstration projects. So when, on one hand, we found that women with disabilities were often further restricted from traveling outside in public spaces, because on one hand it is a conservative society, but also the disability then also becomes another kind of barrier, if you will, in a very inaccessible environment. That became a key issue that we identified. And the other pieces were that access to public spaces was not only about the public open space itself, but reaching that space as well. So I think this is a work in progress. We are hoping to publish these guidelines in March of next year, 2023. And also, I hope that this will become a good practice for combining three major aspects related to gender, universal design, and nature-based solutions in low and middle income countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonal, for speaking about facing climatic threats in our regions head-on by maybe creating progressive guidelines and in collaboration with the vulnerable communities that we are working with as well. Quemuel, I'd like to sort of reach out to you to share your thoughts as well.
So what I like to add to this, and I absolutely would second what was just said from an infrastructure and design perspective. However, something that I'm focused on right now is emergency evacuation planning and redoing almost all of our protocols and practicing those plans, because real life eats policy for breakfast. Practice eats policy for breakfast, we say here. And the reality is that in an emergency situation, people need to know what's going to happen. People need to know what they're expected to do, how they're expected to behave, and where they should go to seek assistance. And that's something that we're looking into very closely here, redoing those drills with persons of all different abilities. A very new a group that has been very vocal here in New York have been parents and caregivers of persons with strollers, either adults in strollers, mothers and caregivers who have children in strollers, and really identifying that they too have accessibility needs that in many systems are going by unmet because they're not considered part of the disability community. Well, they very much so have mobility devices that they're not going to be able to carry up or down a flight of stairs in an emergency situation. So I just like to put again an emphasis on emergency planning today result in successful outcomes in times of emergency for evacuations, where everybody understands their role both as a customer and as a provider, knowing where to go to seek those people who might need additional assistance. And that all starts with setting out very clear terms, conditions, policies, and information to your customers in a really easy to find platform so that they can all educate themselves on what to expect and what to be expected.
And just to build on that, I think it's really interesting, this intersection between communications and disaster preparedness, disaster management, because I think like a lot of times we're not thinking about how we communicate to people and the different ways that we need to be communicating. So I think there's a really nice intersection between your first point that you brought up and the point you just did right now. But at the heart of this, I mean, I really think, and again, you brought this up too, that caregivers have a hard time with access, and I think it's partly because of the paradigm of transportation planning, which has for so long been focused on non-disabled male commuter and neglects every other type of user, whether they be young, old, or with different abilities. So, like, I think the one of the things that we need to be trying to do is change that transportation paradigm planning. And I know, like, maybe Sonal, you can talk a little bit about this too, but like, how do we do that? How do we change the process of doing that? And I think it could be interesting, Sonal, for you to talk a little bit about what you're talking about with getting people out and experiencing things. But for Quemuel and Yoga, it might also be interesting to be speaking from the perspective of being inside an agency as well, even as you are a person with a disability. For you, Yoga.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Kumal said. It raised a point there, because I don't think we in Indonesia prepare very well in emergency situation scenarios. I mean, the importance of preparedness is something that we don't have. Like during these days when there were a lot of um, what do you call it, demonstration, and a sudden change of bus route, people with disabilities are the most vulnerable in this kind of situation when they are transferred to a route where there were no accessible bus stations. So they are confused. Where should we go from there, or what kind of follow-up we can take to our original destination? That is what I think that we are not prepared. Thank you. Thank you for reminding us.
And if I can chime in to answer the question that you framed, I should have also said at the beginning when I was identifying myself, I am a person with a disability too. I am a paraplegic and use a wheelchair to get around here. And something that I'm working on, because I experience it myself, is again this sense of trust us. A government and a lot of these entities, police, fire, really operate, at least here in America, in a trust us system where, because we live in such a litigious environment in the United States, people are a little shy to talk about their process and their operations, when really, as a customer, as an end user, I do not trust what I do not know. So trust me isn't going to work for me to feel comfortable and safe navigating a train system, a rail system, a bus network. And again, I bring it all back to access to information. I need to know what to expect, and I need to know what people are expecting of me in all scenarios, so that we can feel that we're collectively we're aware and we're understanding of what to do and what to expect, what's about to happen next. And that's why I have such an emphasis on real user, end user experiencing these things before we get to an emergency situation. And it's been really challenging bringing in those partners at the fire department, at the police department, because of course, the last thing they want is a non-officer questioning their operations. And I've spent a lot of time building comfort around the fact that, I'm not here it's not a gotcha exercise. I'm just here to learn so that I can communicate to our customers who were desperately trying to say, come back, use the system again. We lost more than half of our riders during the pandemic. And part of my invitation back is, come back to a system that's more transparent. Come back to a system that's going to give you very little, if any, surprises at all. Come back to a system that you're going to know how to move in, because we're going to communicate and educate you every step of the way on what to do and what to expect.
Agree,
Thank you.
Quemuel.
Yeah, Arya, would you like to add a point?
No, I think I completely agree with Quemuel. Thank you.
Definitely, and I mean to the point prior, and even about the one that Sonal had mentioned about really helping our stakeholders even understand the issue. So, just giving an example of when we were working in the city of Chennai as well, even for the simplest thing of just having safe, wide, and comfortable infrastructure, when we got the engineers designing these cities to sit on a wheelchair and really experience that street as how a person with a disability would have experienced it, I think we were able to really change their minds. Because until then, they had not had that experience at all, and they could not imagine what that would be. So, really helping our stakeholders who are designing our streets to experience what persons with disabilities would, I think would really like change the way they go about designing their cities as well. So, no, did you have a point? Yeah, over to you.
No, absolutely agree with you, Aswathy. You know, the just want to kind of re-emphasize and reinforce, especially in a country with a very limited capacity in terms of understanding both gender and universal access. To me, I think, emphasizing the personal is the political in a way that what does a person feel, not as a person in a wheelchair or a person with limited, with visual impairments. I think doing these exercises is probably a way to reach them and communicate with them as well. So, want to completely emphasize this and say that I agree with you.
Thanks, Ronald. Kamal, over to you.
Just briefly, and I know this isn't the topic that we're discussing here, but Sonal, to your point, I've been a transportation officer now for over 10 years, and I have to say that though I agree with you, there's a step that's even before that can address it, and that is hiring diverse people to do projects. And it's something that I'm focusing on very closely here at the MTA. We are a $1 trillion operation organization, and I am making sure that all of our contractors and subcontractors understand that I am very interested and demanding a diverse pool of contractors, operators, people doing the work for me, because I know that not often is my team able to reach every project out there. And one way that I can safeguard having to do that audit, that due diligence of, making sure that I'm asking for the right things, making sure that they know what I want, and that is a completely inclusive, universal, and accessible project. Also, the people that do that can be people who are neurodiverse, who are, bring the disability, that diversity to the table, and that includes having parents, caregivers, definitely people with disabilities who still in America remain the second largest overeducated, underemployed demographic. And that's because we haven't looked to the disability community as people who are capable of doing this work for us, despite the fact that so many of us have all the degrees that everybody else does. So really that's a barrier that we need to focus on, because that's how change will happen as well. You're not always going to be able to reach every project, every contract, but you can start to make that shift by contracting people who have that lived experience and the knowledge, the expertise to deliver what you want to see.
Thanks, Kamal. Very important to hire a diverse team. Aimee, over to you.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. I think that's a really interesting point. Something that you brought up earlier was this idea of no surprises and trust. And I think that's a really important thing that is underestimated in transportation planning and transportation systems, is this idea of trust. And Iain, I think you had brought this up back at the World Urban Forum, about trust and no surprises during the journey. And I thought it might be interesting if you could talk a little bit about that So I'm passing it to you.
Yeah, no, sure, thanks. It's really interesting listening to the conversation. I agree with a lot of what's been said. I would add that giving people confidence is really important. As much as getting a good user experience, but having information, I think, empowers you to have confidence about your journeys and about what you're going to be doing day to day. I also just wanted to mention before I forget how important education is, and that's a big bit of the work that we do at GDI Hub is to educate. We've launched a master's course that we teach. We have a module on there on inclusive design and environment, and I'm very passionate about the fact I think all designers across all sectors from all design disciplines, and in fact more than that, kind of people going into roles that are where they're decision makers, I think should have at the very least at undergraduate level, an understanding of inclusion and inclusive design. I think that should be a kind of mandatory module that people get, so that it's kind of there and baked in, so that these future leaders, in the sector, disabled, non-disabled, students going into careers, have that as a basis, as a foundation, and to try and reduce the currently the kind of dependence on consultants kind of coming in at certain stages on projects and things. So I think education is the long game for me in this, or certainly plays a big part. In terms of what we're talking about, kind of information and kind of being empowering, yeah, I mean it's so important. I think perhaps the example I gave at World Urban Forum was thinking about what are smart cities, what do they mean, the role of technology and things, and I think, as has been said, it's about having that information in real time that can empower you to make decisions, your own decisions about your journey, whatever it may be. The classic example, we would give that we get a lot in transport networks in the UK, certainly, and everywhere, is lifts breaking down. It happens all the time. They go out of commission, but they break down, or they're going through maintenance. And if you rely on a lift, if you can't use stairs, if you need to use the lifts, then that can really kind of destroy your day. If you get off your train or metro system or subway, whatever it is, and you get off at the platform and the lift's broken, then what do you do? And it really can, as I say, ruin your day. But if you're able to get that information in real time, it empowers you to make decisions about rerouting. You can decide in advance what you're going to do about it to kind of mitigate that, navigate that, and it kind of empowers you to make your own decisions. And I think we all do that. I certainly do that. When I'm planning journeys to places I've not been before, I look in advance. I get as much information as I can, so I'm informed, to have the confidence about the journey. And disabled people are no different. So the power of information to give you confidence is really important.
Interesting point, Iain. That's so true. And when we think about smart cities, often, especially in the Indian context, smart cities are not necessarily a positive sort of a statement, and just highlighting how the role of technology can empower all citizens if utilized well to make the right decisions is very interesting. Sonal, over to you, to your point.
Yeah, sorry, I might just respond to Quemuel. I think, taking leadership and leading from the front in terms of hiring a diverse team is great. And it probably also highlights some of the challenges and differences between what I think low and middle income countries are and where perhaps more developed nations are as well. Currently, the strategies that we use in order to advocate for more diverse teams is using laws. So, for example, the rights of persons with disabilities in India mentions that you need to have a reserve, and you still have to use affirmative action in these ways to say that you need to reserve at least 4% of all your employees should include persons with disabilities. There is a lot of pushback from transit agencies because they do not make that step to go out, recruit, reach out the right organizations in order to fill vacant positions in their authorities. So I think what you mentioned is great, but I think that this is perhaps also the challenge that countries like ours face.
Thanks, Sonal, for highlighting the gap between the laws that we have and the action that that our teams need to put into practice. So before we move on to the next set of questions, I'd like to really ask our listeners if there's some pressing questions in your minds as you hear this conversation. And if you do have, we'd really encourage you to put your hand up. You could use this really cute heart that is there right at the bottom to choose to raise your hand. So anyone with any questions at this point? And as we wait for our speakers, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll definitely come to you. Let me also just move ahead. So we did speak a lot about the emergency and in fact about the pandemic as well. And the COVID-19 pandemic revealed various flaws in social, physical, and care infrastructure of cities worldwide. So I'd really like to hear from our speakers, what effects has the pandemic had on raising awareness around the issues of access and inclusion? Quemuel, we heard a bit from you. And what were some of the opportunities for change that have come about? Quemuel, would you like to take this? And any other speakers, if you'd like to add, we look forward to hearing from you as well.
I'm sorry, can you rephrase the question? Opportunity for change in what?
So the pandemic, it revealed various flaws, right, with respect to the infrastructure. So the question that I'd like to pose is that, did it also bring about some opportunities to change these flaws that were probably highlighted during this episode itself?
Absolutely, without a doubt. And I think I alluded to it earlier, but particularly around engagement and who's at the table. It was quite difficult for us to ensure a diverse crowd at community board meetings or at meetings that we had where we discussed things like emergency planning, evacuation, design, or even projects that were coming to a neighborhood when those meetings were required to happen during the workday or late at night when a parent had to take care of their children. Having online engagement and conversations allowed people to opt in from wherever they were, wherever they found themselves for as long as they were able to. So that physical barrier of having to come out of work early, to come to a meeting, to engage, to make your point, to be heard and enlighten everyone of the clear omission that they had of the conversation went away. And it gave a beautiful dialogue, a true fabric that represented the community at large, as opposed to, at least in my experience, people who had free time, who didn't have to worry about working to really give the input and talk about what the needs were, and really skewed the many projects and many conversations that were not inclusive and that were not diverse, because you had the same squeaky wheel of, in many cases, affluent people who didn't have work. Well, now that we've gone digital, so many new voices were able to be added to the conversation. And that's something that I keep telling my staff, I never want to go away. And I'm a big fan of hybrid engagements and hybrid platforms like this one, which really allows people from all over the world, from people with a diverse background, to really come together and engage in a conversation like we're doing now. I want to see this for every project here at the MTA, because it's almost like an unlearning of what engagement looked like. We totally missed the mark, and the pandemic helped us see how badly we missed the mark, because we saw all the new people that came to the table when we went to digital conversations.
Thanks, Quemuel. Moving hybrid as an opportunity. Aimee?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I also wanted to just say that during the pandemic, what we saw was the reclamation of a lot of public space for walking and cycling. And I think that, and for just open space generally. And I think that there's something to be said for visibility in public space and having space to move through public space that does change the dynamic. And just to touch on the social resiliency idea, social infrastructure, like our public spaces, like our parks, like our sidewalks, are really important to build social inclusion. And so if you have more space for people to walk, or good accessible space for people to walk, I think that, or cycle or use mobility assists, like all of these things are going to be really contributing to having more representation in public space for people with disabilities. And I just wanted to put a shout out for cycling, because over the pandemic we saw all of these like pop-up cycle lanes happen. And I think that there is, not everyone can cycle, but cycling can be a good option for a lot of people who may have trouble walking, or it is a good option for people with for some people with disabilities. And so I don't think we should sleep on that either. I think if we can expand access to cycling, we can expand people's access too.
Thanks, Aimee. Sonal, did you have a point to make?
My apologies. No, none at this point.
Sure. So, yes, Sonal. Arya, would you like to maybe share some experiences from Indonesia?
Thank you. I think the obvious effect of pandemic in Indonesia is that it is showing the rank of priority of access and inclusion currently in government. So, and whether the government view access and inclusion as part of the solution of the pandemic crisis. So, for example, the plan for access and inclusion, I think they were put on hold, and the resources for the access and inclusion were diverse to the COVID-19 crisis, and namely providing emergency health crisis facilities, but they forgot to include access and inclusion. So it is showing that it is hard for the medics to transport people with disabilities from their homes to the location of the health facilities, and also they don't consider how accessible the health facilities locations are for people with disabilities. So I think the opportunities are, it is now the government thinks that the access and inclusion is part of the solution for any crisis. I think that's the good part from the previous crisis. Thank you.
Thanks, Arya, for highlighting that. And even in India, during the pandemic, provided us this great opportunity of collaborating with the national government for a couple of campaigns that promote walking and cycling, or we refer to them as Cycles for Change and Streets for People programs across more than 100 cities. And as these cities celebrated car-free days, when high-speed vehicles were sort of erased from our streets, it was wonderful to see children, women, elderly, and persons with disabilities using and thriving in our public spaces. So, yeah, I do definitely agree that the pandemic did provide a great opportunity, and it would really be about how we can leverage this opportunity for the future that we have as well. Once again, yes, Arya, do you have another point to make? And coming to Iain after that.
No, thank you. I'm sorry, I think I haven't erased my emoji.
Sure. Iain, did you want to add a few words here?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Sorry, I'm not quite sure how to raise my hand, so sorry. But yeah, just a couple of things that I'll mention reflecting on what's been said. I think COVID and all crises, I think, for me, demonstrates the need for, kind of good inclusive design, inclusion to be anticipatory rather than reactive. I think what you typically tend to see is a very reactive response, and so I think we now understand greater than ever that the importance and the need to really begin to anticipate crises and events of this nature and be a bit better prepared. And I think that when you are so reactive, then it's so easy to forget large swathes of the population. And I think we saw that with disability and disabled people. I think in some of the responses, I think, the impact that things were going to have on certain segments of the population, including disabled people, were forgotten. And I think a way to kind of prevent that is to make sure that inclusive design is integrated, baked in from the start, and inclusive design is a good way to do that, rather than it being an add-on or a bolt-on or additional service or anything like that, which will get forgotten. So I think that's really important. And then the other thing I just say quickly is that, I think that whilst the move to kind of digital clearly unlocked, opportunities for a lot of people, which is great. But I think it's just important to caveat that with it doesn't take away the need for the physical environment to be as accessible. Everyone needs choice. Some people may want to still work remotely, but we need to still look at solutions and providing choice for people in terms of workplace access and things like that. And then just very quickly on kind of cycling and kind of car-free environments and things. I think, again, obviously good for the environment and good for kind of social cohesion and things like that. But again, the devil is so often in the detail with these things, and we have to be very careful when thinking about kind of, I've got a lot of experience in my work on the Olympic Park in London of cycling infrastructure and the potential, tension with pedestrians, particularly pedestrians with sensory impairments, kind of visual hearing impairments, and thinking about kind of car-free proposals and things is to always, that's fine, but always remember that for some people, getting around in their car will be the only option. And so it's about flexibility. Good inclusive design is about flexibility, choice, kind of adaptability, and I think it's important we remember that too. Thanks.
Yeah, and choice is essential as each one of us have a different requirement, definitely. Quemuel, over to you.
I just wanted to briefly also introduce the thought of how essential public transportation is. I think something that we saw during the pandemic here was who was riding the buses, at all hours of the day, and who were still in our train system, even during the pandemic. And it was those essential workers for whom driving was and is never going to be an option. And it really showcases what the need looks like, what the true need looks like for not only accessible transportation, but for mass transit, public transportation. Because as much as we love to talk about micromobility and alternate modes, there are some people who are never going to have the choice, who have never had those choices, and for whom buses and subways are the way to get around. And it's so critical that we look at what their needs are too. And this is often a population that's not in a lot of public meetings, that's not able to engage with government, with us in these types of conversations. And we saw their faces, we saw what they look like, and we know their needs.
Sure, Quemuel. Public transport is a true need for many. Thanks for highlighting that. So once again, I'd like to reach out to our listeners. If any of you have questions, please raise your hand, and we'd really like to hear from you. Any questions at this point?
I had a question. This is Alphonse from ITDP. I think we've heard a lot about kind of how COVID has propelled sort of more digital accessibility in a way. I'd just be interested to hear maybe from Iain or Quemuel how kind of like wayfinding has been affected, especially in terms of allowing more people with different abilities to plan trips better or just be able to see where they're going. In New York, I've noticed lots of stations have installed lots of more kind of brighter and clearer digital signage around lots of transit stations.
I will speak about New York for a sec here, and it's something that we're vigilant on. We are really trying to re-engage with customers more than ever before, particularly on wayfinding, helping tourists, those who don't speak English, understand where they're at and how to get to where they want to go is a top priority for me. as a non-native, and English wasn't my first language, I understand firsthand how disorienting and difficult it can be to navigate. When you're at Grand Central Penn Station with 100,000 people around you at any given moment during rush hour, we really want to provide information to all people, but also to people, who have disabilities, people who are blind or have low vision. And we have been installing tactile maps. We have a lab, J Street Metro Tech, in which we've been testing different wayfinding tactiles on the floor. We have additional information that we now announce in the subways around accessibility, identifying accessible stations to those riders who may not know whether a station is accessible or not. And also, like you said, demarcating in the platforms themselves, boarding areas, platform areas for people to stand so that they know where they're going to be able to find a level boarding space, for people with luggage, with strollers, with a mobility device. Really providing that access to information that I spoke of at the very beginning has become the new priority here, so that we can, and I'm going to sound like I keep using the same phrase, but so that we can not surprise any of our customers. I want everybody to have access to information to move around as independently as possible.
Yeah, I guess thoughts from me on kind of wayfinding and things using public transport. I guess COVID, the impact that had was changed, our habits, and also it was very disruptive. And whereas I think it reduced your choices, whereas before you may have gone to a station and you may have sought a member of staff to ask for help or things like that, and all of a sudden, that kind of close contact became difficult. People were wearing face masks, which made communication problematic, and it just became very disruptive and stressful. Incredibly stressful for a lot of people. Raised anxiety levels and things like that. So I think COVID probably did. I've not researched this, but I would imagine has kind of shifted, I think, how people plan and kind of prepare for journeys, and possibly has led people to be a little more reliant on kind of digital interfaces and planning and things like that. But ultimately, with wayfinding, orientation and things, it's about just really good inclusive design, as has been said. It's going to support everyone from international, visitors whose it's not their first language. So good kind of clear visual contrasts using images or icons, as well as just text, And there's lots of good examples in the across the world from the transport industry of kind of providing kind of maps, orientation, things that are really good examples of inclusive design, really clear, very intuitive, very simple to use, which I think is important. In terms of like things like tactile paving and things, I think I think they can be as guidance paving to kind of find your way. I think they can be helpful, but I think again it's knowing. If you're a first time visitor, it's knowing how to engage in it. Where does it take you? So again, that pre-visit information, as has been said already, so important in that. And then you have the kind of safety features such as the kind of tactile paving at platform edges, top and bottom of stairs, and things like that, which are, we hope is kind of consistent kind of across the world for health and safety purposes. But yeah. It will always be important, and I think, as with everything, good inclusive design should deliver really good, inclusive and intuitive outcomes that support everyone.
Thank you, Iain, for highlighting inclusive and intuitive design, which is very essential for our infrastructure. So moving on to the very last question for today. To our speakers, how can decision making, we've been spoken about how we've already spoken about how we should engage with our community while we improve access and inclusion. So if you could highlight some examples about how decision making at the city or the community level can actually improve access and inclusion, and what have been some of the biggest challenges that you've come across while you move towards this vision? any of our speakers would like to share their thoughts. Iain, were you saying something?
Yeah, so sure. Sorry to jump in, but I genuinely haven't mastered the raise hand feature. Sorry. I'll be quick and just say, yeah, I mean, engagement is essential. I think, as has been said on the call, I think, having disabled people in those positions themselves, making key decisions is incredibly important. I completely agree with that. Yes, and then engagement with local. A good mix of the local community affected by any project, and that must also include disabled people. My personal experience of this was, I was the inclusive design lead for all of for the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in East London in the UK, which has had seen significant development post 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games in London. And we had a built environment access panel. So we had a panel of local residents, business owners, experts, but predominantly disabled people who we engaged and involved in the design process. And my role working there was to facilitate that group and ensure that all the key development projects taking place at the right stage, at a point in design where we could still affect significant changes, the design team would come in and present to the panel. And I facilitated those sessions to be really constructive, and to be positive, because everyone around the table just wanted the designs and the development to be the best it could be, and that was the best part about it. That job was facilitating those built environment access panel sessions, and quite often you would have design teams, architects, firms coming in terrified, genuinely terrified, because it's the first time in their career that they'd ever had to present to a group of disabled people, or in some cases, real local people like to actually interrogate their designs. And what I loved about that panel was just how kind of, how based in reality they were, and they would really hit home the impact that these designs and things were going to have on people's daily lives. And they would make it personal. If I'm going to come here, how do I get there? What's the access like? How is this going to work for me and my family? And I can, countless times, you could see design teams have epiphanies. The penny would drop, and they would kind of understand, the unconscious nature of some of the decisions they'd been making and the impact it was going to have. And you knew that they were going to take that with them in their future work. And so it's incredibly powerful. Good, well-structured engagement is essential. It should be done throughout projects, and it's vital, and it will result in much better outcomes. I guarantee it. I've seen it. Thanks.
Sonal, do you want to go? You had your hand up first.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Aimee. I think I'll speak from a range of experiences based in India. And, and I would like to say that I completely agree with what Iain and Quemuel and Arya have also spoken about. Some of the, I think, emerging good practices that we are seeing now is that some of our largest mass transit projects in India are committing towards one stepless route, as well as an accessible route both to the station and within mass transit stations. I think that is a good move, and that has come largely due to accessibility audits that have been conducted with persons with different impairments. And I think that using both accessibility audits and also, I would say, safety audits can be very powerful tools to show how people actually experience an existing infrastructure or a system. Where some of, and these are in large cities like a regional rail in Delhi, metro rail projects in Bangalore and in Chennai. The challenge still remains in thinking of a whole system approach. For example, looking at first and last mile connectivity from an accessibility perspective, as well as fares, because I believe that, we also need to talk about affordability, as we talk about accessible design as well. Another interesting example, or I think another example we are seeing is from civil society organizations who are using what I would call judicial activism and using the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act of 2019 to take decision makers to court on not providing accessible transportation. So I feel like, I feel that once this also kind of helps sometimes sensitize decision makers, even if it is done through litigation. And the third one that I'd like to point out was talking about how when we have been working with the Delhi government in redesigning 1,400 bus stops in the city, where we created a subcommittee to advise the government and included gender and universal design criteria in the design of the bus stops, and actually organized the competition that would take these principles and invite new and fresh ideas. Our jury also included had both a gender balance, and we ensured that we had a person with disability on the jury. It was a 5-member jury as well. And after which the design was refined. While this process has started in 2018, it still takes time. But for me, this has been a good example of seeing how you can include universal design in your scope of work, in your terms of reference, in the decision-making process as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonal. Thanks, Aimee, for jumping in, because I just dropped off. And thanks, Iain. Some of the points that you'd made were extremely important. Quemuel and Aimee. Aimee, would you like to make a point as well? Because I noticed that you had raised your hand in the past. Yeah.
Yeah, I would. Thank you. I actually just wanted to talk a little bit about my own kind of journey with transportation planning. I started 20 years ago looking at transportation and sustainable and equitable outcomes. And at that time, even considering people with disabilities was written off as too expensive and not worth the investment. And a lot of planners, even like myself, didn't challenge that. And I think the times have changed a lot. And I really liked Iain's point about inclusive and intuitive design being good for everyone. I think that's true. But I also think retrofitting is so much more expensive than centering universal accessibility in your plans and projects from the beginning. So I do think one of the challenges that we've heard a lot is it's too expensive. And I think the flip side of that is, but retrofitting or not doing enough is even more expensive. And just one point about just to say that I do think things are changing. I think the Peshawar BRT system in Pakistan is a really good example of how in the planning process they brought in a local community organization of people with disabilities to help with the planning process. And even then there's lessons learned about like who was included and who wasn't and how do we make it more inclusive. But it's a good example. So thank you.
Thanks, May, for sharing, putting spotlight on Peshawar BRT system. Quemuel, over to you. What are your thoughts?
Thank you. I just want to add, and Aimee just hinted at what I'm coming for in her last statement there about understanding who you're listening to. And Iain, you made some great points about decision making and democratizing those decisions and diversifying those stakeholders. I think it's imperative that we always pay attention to whom we're listening to, even when we think about intuitive design. Intuitive to whom. And I just want to put a plug for some healthy tension. And I always say that if there isn't any tension in my conversations, then someone's missing, because we rarely have every stakeholder at the table. We rarely have every need at the table. And I'm just going to make a plug for seeking out healthy tension, because that's how I know that I've done my job in diversifying my table and making sure that as many voices are represented, is when we do have healthy tension and disagreements, because disability and access and universal design is quite obtuse, and it always involves voices that are probably missing at the table. So never forget that we're probably never done in filling that table with the stakeholders and silent voices.
Thank you so much, Quemuel, for highlighting that if there isn't any tension in our conversations, then there's someone who's definitely missing. We'll definitely keep that in mind. We are coming to the end of this very engaging conversation. And before we close the conversation, I'd like to go to each of our listeners each of our speakers and invite you to share one last point, a ray of hope to our listeners. Sonal, shall I start with you? One last point from you, Sonal.
I think it's been said. I don't know. Perhaps I think the one big piece would be is diversify your team and pay attention to inclusive and intuitive design.
Thanks, Sonal. Diversify your team. We've heard that before, but thanks for highlighting that. Quemuel, over to you.
As a person with a disability who wasn't born with a disability, I acquired my disability downhill mountain biking 15 years ago. I've really been part of two worlds out here. Before my accident, I used to work in finance at big investment banks, and I then became disabled, lived in a hospital for 10 months in rehab, and I've been navigating this world as a person with a disability. And I'd just like to highlight the social model of inclusion and the lens of the disability community as, erasing and eradicating everything that we learn in textbooks and in school about the medical model, which really teaches us to see people with disabilities as patients, people who need services, people who require assistance. And as a person with a disability, I'll tell you, I live in New York City by myself and I travel the world. I'm a deep sea scuba diver, and I contribute a lot to my environment, not only here in New York, but Dominican Republic, my native home, and also the world in conversations like these. So my point is, people with disability have a lot to contribute if provided the access, if invited to the table. And this is what an invitation looks like: true engagement, not just a sideline, silence listening as a participant. So don't forget to erase everything you learn about the medical model that spoke to you of disabilities and lean in and engage, because the world is missing out on the true hackers of the world, which I always say are people with disabilities, because we hack everything every day because very little is designed for us.
Quemuel, I am truly inspired listening to you, and I'm sure many of our speakers would be as well. So thank you so much for that. Over to you, Iain. What are your last thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. I'll just leave by saying I think there's room for a lot of optimism here. I've also been working in this sector, this space, for almost 20 years, which I can't quite believe. And I've seen it go from quite niche, quite bespoke, kind of on the fringe, to being a sector in the built environment industry now where there's a lot of hustle, there's a lot of players, there's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of interest, and I think that's a great thing. I'm very optimistic for the future. There's a lot of work to do, but I think it's gradually picking its way up the agenda, which is great.
Thank you so much, Iain. Lots to do and lots coming our way. So over to you, Arya. What are your thoughts? Arya, would you like to share your thoughts? While we wait to hear from Arya. Yeah, yes, Arya, over to you.
Okay. Can you hear me, Mike? Can you hear my voice? So I think political will is playing very major part in putting universal access in transportation infrastructure. Funding will follow political will, but political will will and will also follow public trans support, which come from public awareness. So the biggest challenge is to mingle, to appear in public, to use public transportation, and before the inclusive transportation even exists. So I encourage fellow person with disabilities to to use public facilities, public transportation, mingle, blending with other communities in our societies. So the awareness of the lack of inclusive transportation will raise, and it will create the uh, political will needed to make it a reality. Thank you.
Thanks, Arya, for highlighting the importance of political view and also for encouraging our persons with disabilities to use the infrastructure and demand the change. Finally, Aimee, I'd like you to leave us with the last thoughts. So over to you, Aimee.
That's a little bit of a pressure, but I guess I agree with everything that everyone has said. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think for me, the thing that I keep grounding myself in is that disability is diverse, and I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we think about our transportation and land use systems, and what does that mean. And then I think the last part of that is taking intersectional approaches when we think about people with disabilities, because there's a lot of intersections around gender, around income, around race or ethnicity or religion. I think that has to really be part of the conversation as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, all of our speakers, for really throwing so many insights on transforming our cities and making them truly accessible and inclusive for all. I'd also like to take this moment to thank all our listeners for tuning in and being a part of this conversation. Last but not the least, Alphonse, Maeve, and Ivona, who've been in the backstage supporting this conversation as well. And anyone else who's been a part of this discussion. Thank you so much. And looking forward to seeing you the next time around.
Thank you, Aswathy.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.